Today, we're going to talk about anatomy of a fall in relation to the plight of successful women and victimhood. I know I'm super late to get to it, but when I watched this film, I was completely in awe, super shocked, and had so many thoughts coming out of the theater. Quickly, I want to give a disclaimer. If you haven't watched this film already, there will definitely be spoilers throughout, so make sure that you've seen it before you come and watch this video. So Anatomy of a Fall is about a German writer named Sandra who lives in the rural parts of France with her husband and their son, Daniel. They're far from civilization. They live in a really isolated space. You can tell that they are the only people in the area. Their view is very beautiful. It's snowy, there's mountains, it looks like a chalet almost, the house that they're living in, but in the house, there's actually a lot of tensions between Sandra and her husband. Quickly into the film, Sandra's husband is found dead by their youngest son. It seems like he has fallen off of the top floor of their house, and subsequently, Sandra has been accused of murdering her husband. We follow Sandra into court, where she pleads not guilty to the murder of her husband, where we see prosecutors reveal secrets and very intimate moments between Sandra and her husband, and the real nature of their relationship starts to come to exposure in front of a jury, in front of their son. In the entire scene where they're in court, the defense lawyers are using tactics to make their claim, and the prosecutors are using their own tactics to make their claim, and the truth is really being twisted and turned in multiple different directions. It's very clear that Sandra's relationship with her husband was very volatile from both ends. So it makes me ask the question of what makes a woman good or bad, a victim or a murderer in cases like these. In their relationship, I truly believe that both parties are at wrong to a certain degree. We can see in arguments between Sandra and her husband that both of them have their faults in the relationship. But once Sam has passed away and we're in court, everything that's gone on in the relationship gets pinned to one side, working against Sandra. And that brings me to my first point, which is that being seen as a victim is really difficult because we expect a victim to be all good in order to get our sympathy and in order for us to feel for them. And this is especially true for women. We cannot seem to see a woman as a victim unless she is completely innocent, free of guilt, free of any blame. And as soon as we start to see that a woman has even the slightest bit of responsibility in a situation where things have gone left, we take away that victim title and assume that she deserves what came for her. Because this is a case of domestic violence, I want to point out how when it comes to abusive relationships, we expect women to be docile and gentle in contrast to their male partners who are the aggressors, who are the violent ones. But in this movie, Sandra doesn't fit that stereotype. Sandra, honestly, is a reverse of gender roles. She's the successful one in her relationship. She's the one who has gone to accomplish a lot of things in her career. In a lot of my discussion, I'm going to talk about the most pivotal argument that we hear exposed in the courtroom. Sam had a bunch of recordings that he took before he had passed away without Sandra's knowledge of their conversations. The last argument that they had, the one that seems to be the most violent one, was taken 20 hours before his death. So it's used as a key form of evidence for the prosecutors to claim that Sandra is the one that pushed Sam off the edge. In this argument, Sam starts off by blaming Sandra for his inability to find time to write. He says that they are moving on her turf, that everything that him and Daniel do are in accordance to what she wants and what she needs, and because of that, he has not been able to give his writing and give his career time, and he feels almost cornered in their relationship to have to live in a way that only supports Sandra's ambitions and Sandra's goals. But Sandra points out how they had moved all the way to France, rural France, when they had a comfortable life in London, one that she quite enjoyed, because he needed to be far away and he needed to be in an environment that he was familiar with. Sam had grew up in France, he's French. She had done that for him, and it's not fair that he claims that they're on her turf when she tried to meet him in the middle by agreeing to move to France, even though she doesn't even speak the language. And I find this part to be really upsetting personally, because Sam claims that she imposes her language on him and his son. But English is not her first language, as Sandra points out. She speaks German, her husband speaks French, and English is that middle ground for all of them. And living in France means that she's got to speak French most of the time, even though it's not her first language, even though she's not entirely fluent in that language either. And we see this in the courtroom too, where she has to answer questions and defend herself in French. And there are a lot of moments where she has to turn to her defense lawyer and ask him how to say something or even get an interpreter to translate what she's saying because she's not entirely able to communicate her thoughts or what's happened in French. But anyways, I digress. For the most part, almost the entirety of the argument, Sandra has a very calm and collected tone. She doesn't come off defensive. She's not yelling. She even says, "I love you," and makes suggestions that Sam could take in order to help him write and in order to get himself in a space where he's able to be his creative self. But Sam is not here for it. He's incredibly upset, and you can tell from the beginning all the way to the end of the argument that he's already at 100, that he is so frustrated that he has no room for any civil conversation with Sandra about what they can do about the feelings that he has about their relationship. In the end of their argument, we hear an altercation. In this part of the argument, we no longer get to have a flashback and see exactly how this argument played out. Instead, we are with the jury, with the witnesses in court, just listening to the altercation. And it is very clear that both people are being violent. But right away, the prosecutors accuse Sandra of being violent first and pin her as the one who was the aggressor in this argument, saying that from the beginning she was incredibly upset and that she was the first one to hit and be violent with her husband, even though for the most of the argument, we can hear how upset Sam is. And in contrast, Sandra is quite calm and collected. I think it's interesting how the core of the argument is that Sandra's career has taken off because she's able to do things how she wants to, according to Sam. And as a consequence of her taking all this time, his career has had to suffer. So we can see that their dynamic is not necessarily what we would typically think of a heterosexual marriage. She is clearly the successful one, the one who's doing well for herself. And the prosecutors almost use that to leverage their point that she was the violent one first. And then she responds saying that she had slapped him and tried to stop him from knocking things off of their table, but he had gone and done that anyways and even punched a hole in the wall before he started to slap himself. So clearly both people were aggressive. There wasn't one person who was throwing hands and the other was just, taking it. And yet I feel like because Sandra is seen as the breadwinner in their family, the successful one out of the two, she's seen as being the powerful one in the relationship and accused of being the one to have been violent first and violent from the start. So coming back to my point, we can see how both people have played a role in making each other upset and getting to this violent place. Sure, Sandra was calm throughout the argument, but she objectively could have at least tried to understand maybe where Sam was coming from. And I don't feel like this argument is like the argument that ended their relationship. I just feel like it's one of the peak arguments that they've had. There is clearly a lot of emotions that both people are feeling, but their lack of communication, their lack of ability to come to conclusions together, to effectively tell one another what they feel and be able to talk it out has led to this point where they have this argument that leads to absolutely nothing and nowhere, like nothing beneficial comes out of this argument. There's so much of the relationship that we don't get to see, but no one has one argument that seems to be the end all be all. They have obviously been feeling these things for a while and have not chosen to talk about these things together, to find a middle ground together, to work together as a team. And that's why this argument has boiled up to such a heat. But because Sandra is the more successful one out of the two, it is easier to pin her a blame because she is put in this position of power compared to her husband, even though her husband is the one who was incredibly upset from the beginning of the argument, seemed to have no intention of actually coming to some type of conclusion or resolution together, and also physically is much bigger than Sandra is and can do a lot more harm to her than she possibly could. But this is not to say that women cannot be violent in relationships and cause harm. In another part of the prosecutor's defense, they bring up that Sandra was disloyal in their relationship, that she had extramarital affairs, and she's a bisexual woman. So they bring her sexuality into the case, and they use an interview that Sandra did with this young woman, this young journalist from a university, as proof that she was someone who was very much interested in women and was disloyal to her husband and probably felt very annoyed with him being in the way of her ability to have these relationships outside of their marriage as another reason to why she killed him. The opening scene in the film is Sandra having this interview with this journalist, and Sandra seems very relaxed. She does seem quite interested in this interview, but it's very clear that they cannot continue because her husband is blaring 50 Cent's Pimp, making it almost impossible for them to have any kind of conversation. So she ends the interview and says that maybe they can meet another time somewhere else and continue where they left off. And so the prosecutors decide to dissect this interview, this very short interview, by saying that Sandra was manipulative, that she was trying to seduce the interviewer by having wine involved and by being super comfortable and laid back. And they put this young woman on the stand, and she explains that she didn't feel like she was being seduced in this interview. She just felt like Sandra really needed to talk to someone, and so she was comfortable, she was relaxed, but they couldn't continue because of the strange situation that they were in, which is that her husband was playing this loud music while they were clearly having an interview. But the prosecutors are certain that Sandra being bisexual means that she had to be interested in this woman, that she wanted something more out of the journalist, and the fact that she couldn't get it because of her husband interrupting them was one of her motives to want to kill him. They really use her sexuality as a weapon against her. In my opinion, it's not a valid argument to say that because somebody's interested in both men and women, that as soon as a woman or a man steps into their house, that they are automatically interested in them. And again, this is a recording, so we don't even get to really physically see what Sandra looks like. At least the court can't. We can when we watch the film, but the jury and the witnesses don't actually get to see what Sandra looks like. So we can only assume from her tone of voice that she was comfortable, that she was ready to take on this interview, but that doesn't indicate that she had any other motives. And so again, I find that because Sandra isn't straight, they make her the aggressor in their relationship by saying that, well, she's into everybody. So as soon as someone comes into their house, she has to be interested in them. Even though in the argument that the court plays, Sandra has said that she was never not down to do sexually intimate things with her husband, that it was him who had put a stop to it, and that at some point she couldn't tolerate it anymore, that she just couldn't stand the fact that they weren't intimate in bed. And I'm not saying that infidelity needs to be excused, that there's ever a chance for it to be excused. And I don't think Sandra's saying that either, but it is her giving some context as to how she ended up having these affairs outside of their marriage. This just goes to show how both of them are at fault in different ways in their relationship. I mean, if Sandra was so frustrated with their lack of romance, that should have been her exit of the relationship. It's difficult to leave a marriage, but that should have been enough reason for her to be like, okay, I can't stay in this marriage anymore. I'm literally not getting what I physically need. I've got to get it somewhere else, which means I can't be loyal. So I should probably end this. But instead of being able to see the nuance to this situation, we are immediately convinced that because Sandra is bisexual, she holds this resentment for her husband because she's unable to have these relationships freely. Finally, the prosecutors even use her career against her. She's a successful writer. She's wrote many books. The prosecutor brings out one of the books that she had recently wrote to prove that she had this intention to kill her husband. He reads out an excerpt from this book that she wrote where a wife is very frustrated with her husband and thinks about what he would look like if he was dead and what she would do with his dead body. And he continues to say that Sandra has admitted that a lot of her writing comes from her own personal life and that she wrote specifically about a situation of a wife murdering her husband, which is a key indicator of the fact that that is what she wanted to do inside. And I do believe that art is a reflection of the artist, and it's very hard to separate an artist from their artistry. But if we held every writer accountable for what they wrote, which a writer's job is to literally write fiction, to come up with stories, to create these scenarios that we can only imagine through fiction. Writing as a craft is an incredibly difficult craft, and you cannot necessarily hold a writer to what they write. You can definitely say that themes that come up in their writing are a reflection of their own life, but the exact actions of their fictional characters are not a viable reason to say that, oh, well, this author would definitely do this. If we think in that way, then writers will lose their creative freedom to be able to come up with characters and all these scenarios. Overall, what I can say is that it's very clear that in the flashbacks that we're seeing between Samuel and Sandra, they are both at fault in different ways and have done damage to one another. Their relationship had ended a long time ago, and it would have been in their best interest if someone decided to step out of it, but neither of them took on that responsibility and stayed in this very messy relationship. Their relationship has suffered from a huge disconnect from each other and a huge lack of communication. Both of them seem to move independently, kind of just stringing the other person along until they get to this huge argument where they both start pointing fingers at one another. But what's most interesting to me is how this film points out that, especially in relationships, it is very hard to come up with just a one-sided truth. That is almost never the case. You can never point a finger at just one person and blame them for everything. That there's almost in every case two people at fault. Samuel's therapist gets on the stand and claims that Sandra had really put all this pressure and blame and guilt on him, and that she was part of the reason why he was suffering so much mentally. And Sandra points out how he's sitting there on the stand and blaming her and calling her and saying all these ugly things about her. But if she had gone to a therapist and she was expressing her sufferings, her grievances in their marriage, that they could also have done the same about Samuel, and that there is really no one side in this relationship of just one person hurting over the other, because in a relationship, sometimes you fight together, sometimes you fight fight each other, and that it's just chaotic. It's a big mess. Relationships are incredibly difficult. They're hard to understand. They're hard to grasp because people are so complex. And when two people come together, that's two very sophisticated individuals trying to understand one another. And every couple knows that you have your highs and you have your lows. It's very hard to explain those highs and lows to people outside of the relationship. But the truth is something that we all seek. We want to be able to understand it. We want to be able to pin it, even though it's not always easy to do that. Sometimes it's impossible to do that. And this film explores that. Can we always come to a conclusion and uncover the truth? Or is the truth this gray space where sometimes we can't put it in one box or the other and we have to let it drift in between? Another film that explores similar themes is 12 Angry Men, which is about 12 members of a jury, an all-white jury, who must decide whether or not the accused is guilty, and the accused is an inner city teen. A guilty verdict would mean the death of the accused. As the men try to reach a unanimous decision, we start to see their biases and their own life experiences which influence what they want to believe instead of actually searching for the truth. Even in real life, we can see how the truth is so difficult to grasp and that we will pick whatever narrative we think fits best. Most recently, the Depp versus Heard case, there was a public understanding that Johnny Depp was the victim in this situation, whereas if you were to really look at the case, you can see how both parties played a role in this violent relationship. But because Heard is a woman, she cannot be seen as a victim if there's any form of retaliation, if there's any sign of self-defense. I personally don't think that Sandra killed her husband. At first, when I walked out of the theater, I did. I was kind of sure that she had killed him because she lacked such an emotional reaction to his death. I felt like, you know, if your husband just passed away, you should be shocked to some degree. But I think she knew that it was coming and she had seen his death as something that was pending, maybe because she better understood his mental state. I mean, they lived together, regardless of their lack of romance. They lived together and they knew each other better than anyone else in that courtroom did. I think Samuel definitely felt very guilty for a lot of things and felt resentful about a lot of things too, and was so ashamed of himself and his inability to write, and ultimately chose to take his own life, but do it in a way that was damaging to Sandra, that would put her in this position where she would have to defend herself and could potentially go to jail. I think that was his last form of vengeance towards her, because he obviously felt like she had destroyed so much of his life and taken so much out of him. The most upsetting part of this case, though, is the fact that Daniel, their 11-year-old son, is in the middle of this, that he is so young and so innocent, obviously can't completely understand his parents' relationship and the nuances and the complexities to it. Now he has to decide whether or not his mom is guilty or not, and now he has to come to conclusions about their life that is almost impossible for any 11-year-old to do. It's a very traumatizing event for him as well. Those are my thoughts on Anatomy of the Fall. It's very hard to come up with a concrete conclusion because I think the whole film explores how it's almost impossible to do that. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I'd be so curious to hear your opinions and your thoughts if you did watch the film yourself. So make sure to leave a comment down below. And if you have not subscribed already, what is you doing, bruv? Get to it. I will see you guys in my next video.